Hi, everyone. Hold on to your hats and get yourself cozy because today's episode is shocking. I have 3 stories that are sure to remind you to keep your eyes and ears open and looking over your shoulder. Not paying attention is not an option. So get ready to batten down the hatches, but first, please capture that subscribe button. Great. Now let's get into the stories. I was working at a wildlife preserve in northern Minnesota. We were working on a project to track the population of fishers in the area. Unfortunately, they had been nearly wiped out in the area several years back, and we were making an attempt to reestablish a breeding population. Fishers are problematic to study. They're solitary animals and they're difficult to track, trap, and collar. Imagine a ferret on steroids with the personality of a wolverine. This project led me into some pretty remote wilderness areas, oftentimes alone. This was one of those times. It was the dead of winter. I had a few live traps set up in an area where we had caught fishers on game camera. Like I said, they're difficult to trap, so I wasn't hopeful to find anything. Still, I had to check them in case something was in there. The trail to get to the traps required a snowmobile to make it through. There were 3 traps to check, 2 in a forest and 1 I had to cross a frozen bog to get to. Luckily, the budget for this preserve didn't allow for one of those nice new snowmobiles, and so I had this machine from the late 70s. I say luckily because this thing was much lighter than the newer sleds, and honestly, that's the only reason I felt comfortable taking it over the bog. I checked the traps in the forest first and found nothing in one and a raccoon in the other. I released the raccoon and headed towards the bog. I had to drive out of the forest across a prairie area and then down a steep hill to the bog. There was a river running through the area that typically froze in the winter, but I didn't have to cross that. As soon as I got into the prairie, I felt like something was wrong. I couldn't say just what it was. Even looking back, I just sort of knew. I pushed the feeling to the back of my mind, though, and continued on, basically forgetting it. I didn't want to turn around, but I also couldn't leave the trap without checking to see if something was stuck in there. I knew I had reached the bog when I saw the green reeds poking up out of the snow. They were the only bit of color in the entire landscape. Everything else was covered in ice and snow and frozen. I stopped the sled near the trap. I didn't see anything inside, but I smelled something absolutely rotten. We used to use chicken livers for the traps. They're stinky and the fishers like them, but they don't smell this bad. No, there was definitely something else around. I didn't see any animal carcasses near me. In fact, there were no signs of animals at all. Usually when I drive in with the snowmobile, everything on 4 legs scatters away, but there are usually tracks all over to look at. But this time, there was nothing. The only tracks I found were mine from when I set the trap the day before yesterday. I was just about to get on my snowmobile and go, but then out of the corner of my eye, I saw 2 elk antlers pointing out of the snow. They were less than 20 yards away from the sled. We do have elk up here in northern Minnesota, but they are rare. This looked to be shed antlers or a skull. It didn't jump up and leave when I came in with the snowmobile, so I assumed it was dead. A set of elk antlers is a pretty neat find, and I wanted to bring them back to the station. But when I approached, the rotting smell overpowered me. Normally an animal carcass won't stink like that during the winter. That should have been my first sign to get out of there, but I decided to investigate further. I really wanted to take those antlers home. As I began to approach what I thought was an elk carcass, something moved beneath the snow. I stepped backwards as soon as I saw it move, but it was tough to move quickly. The creature was slow to rise up from the ground. It moved like it was aged. Its bones clicked and popped, and it was emaciated at best. In fact, I was surprised that it was still alive from the state that the body was in. It had its back to me when it got up, so I hadn't seen the face yet. The fur was as white as the snow. I figured it must be some sort of an albino mutation or something. I got back to my sled and started it up. The elk was close enough that I wanted to put some distance between us in case it decided to charge. And this is when it turned around, and I can't tell you how terrified I was. This thing had fur all over its body, except for its face, and the skin was stripped from the skull. It was just bone from what I could see, and I couldn't see any eyes in the dark sockets, but when it turned to look at me, I know it saw me, eyes or not. I didn't see a lower jaw either. I don't think it had one. There was just this flap of pinkish meat hanging down from its throat. It must have been a tongue or something. I was so afraid I was struggling to grasp the pull cord on the snowmobile, and it took 3 tries to get it started, all while the creature was fixated on me. It then began walking towards me. Its movements were jarring, like its legs weren't connected to the rest of the body. Sort of hard to describe. But then I got the snowmobile running before it reached me, and I sped off. I kept looking back over my shoulder, but it didn't attempt to chase me. I know what I saw wasn't one of those sick or diseased elk. The natives up here have a name for it, but I won't say it here. The legends say that this creature thing is a danger to humans, and I'm lucky to have escaped as easily as I did. I think I woke the beast from a deep sleep, and that must have been why it didn't try to chase me. Hibernation, maybe? I don't know. I don't really know, but I do know that I won't go back into that area alone or without a gun. Hey Lilith, I'm a firm believer in the supernatural. I know it's real, and I've had a few experiences to back it up. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and while it's mainly known as a tourist paradise with beaches, mountains, surfing, and luau's, there's also a dark side that most aren't aware of unless you live there. Hawaii is ripe with history, folklore, and spirituality, and there are hauntings all over the islands. Popular spirits include Madame Pele, the goddess of fire, the Menehune, the choking ghost, the faceless woman of Waialae Drive-In, and the Green Lady of Wahiwa. One of the scariest encounters that I've personally had involves the most legendary ghosts of all. In Hawaiian, they're the Huakaipu, but are more commonly known as the Night Marchers. Anyone who lives in Hawaii has at least heard of them. They are very real. The Night Marchers are the ghosts of ancient Hawaiian warriors said to travel on certain trails from sunset to sunrise. Supposedly, they appear during the last 4 phases of the moon, before it goes dark. It's said that you'll know when the Night Marchers are coming when you hear their drumbeat and the sound of the shell. You'll see their torches in a single line descending down the mountains. That's your cue to run and hide. You're not supposed to look at them. If you do, they will pull you in and you'll be doomed to walk with them for eternity. You're supposed to show deference and respect by taking your clothes off and laying face down in the ground. If you do look at them, it's possible to be saved by an ancestor who is marching with them. The ancestor will call your name and claim you as theirs, and your life will be spared. Simply put, these are not the kind of spirits to be trifled with. One summer weekend, my cousin and I were camping and boar hunting. I won't say where because it's best if people don't try to go there. It was near the base of a mountain, and we had to hike a few miles after parking off a dirt road. On our first day, we bagged a boar and cleaned it. Then we cooked some of the meat for dinner. We had a few beers afterwards and just talked story, laughing into the late hours of the night. There were no clouds, and the tapestry of stars was a sight to behold. The moon was just a sliver, but I didn't think anything of that at the time. We eventually went to sleep, but a few hours later, my cousin violently shook me awake. I didn't recognize him at first in my half-asleep stupor, and I almost punched him in the face. But I quickly saw the terror in his eyes. I had never seen him as scared as he was in that moment. He told me to shut up and listen, and that's when I heard it. A slow, steady drumbeat, and then the sound of the shell blowing. It was in the distance, but not too far away. I looked at him in disbelief. I think I may have even laughed, but he yanked me up with one arm and he pointed at the mountain. Through the trees, I saw it. It looked like floating fireballs streaming down the mountain in a single line. It was them, the Night Marchers. From out of nowhere, we were hit with a wave of warm air as the drumbeat grew louder and louder. We got up and ran, abandoning our campsite and blindly plowed through the jungle. The sound of the shell blowing was now closer, and out of my peripheral vision I could see a soft orange glow. A mist began to surround us, and we were assaulted with the horrid stench of something rotten. My cousin screamed at me to get down. I knew I was supposed to take my clothes off, but there was no time for that. So I just dropped to the ground face down and I closed my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited there for what seemed like forever. I felt the warm air wash over me as the drumbeat was finally upon us. But I couldn't help it. Curiosity got the best of me and I peeked through my fingers. All I could see was the ground in front of me. I was enveloped by a swirling mist that glowed orange from the torches that the night marchers carried. I caught glimpses of legs walking right past me, but they didn't have feet. Against my better judgment, I looked up. I will never forget what I saw. They were apparitions, shadows of towering men dressed in traditional Hawaiian warrior garb, capes and helmets. They were obscured by the orange glowing mist, so I couldn't make out their faces. They all carried torches in one hand, spears and other ancient weaponry in the other. But then the drumbeat stopped, and they halted, turning to look at me. I felt this weird floating sensation, and everything began to spin like I had vertigo. I started to black out, but not before I heard a voice call out my name. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but I woke up to the sound of my cousin yelling for me. The night marchers were gone, and it was dark under a canopy of trees. I got up, and I saw my cousin 20 feet away. I flagged him down. He gave me a big bear hug. He said he was afraid I was lost forever. I somehow ended up pretty far away from where we initially dropped face down. I had no recollection of what happened, other than the brief glimpses I caught when I stupidly looked up at the night marchers. My cousin and I went back to our campsite, waited for dawn, and then we packed up our things and we got out of there. We told our tutu what happened, and she said I was very lucky. She confirmed that our family was descended from the Hawaiian warrior class and that an ancestor claimed me, saving my life. Strangely, that experience gave me a new sense of pride about my heritage. As a culture, Hawaiians revere the land, what we call the Aina, and there's a strong spiritual connection. The Aina deserves our respect, and if we don't give it, we may open ourselves up to a reckoning that we are not prepared for. My wife and I just returned home from what should have been a romantic weekend getaway to upstate New York. It was anything but. We were coming up on our third wedding anniversary, and as a gift, I decided to surprise her with a weekend trip to Lake George. Since it's not exactly tourist season, I got a good deal on a beautiful cabin for 3 nights. It was actually built on one of the small islands dotting the lake, and we would have to take a short boat ride to get to it. My wife was totally surprised, and after we tied up the boat to the small dock on the shore, we got to exploring. The island itself was small, a few hundred yards wide at best. The cabin was spacious, though, and it had an old rustic charm. Artwork of the lake and surrounding area lined the walls. We had gotten here just as it started to get dark, and after a quick dinner, we called it an early night. We were beat after the long car drive and boat ride. The next morning, I woke up early before my wife. I made a pot of coffee and I stepped outside. Enjoying the brisk air, I took a walk down to the shore to check on the boat and make sure it was still securely tied. And that's when I noticed something odd. The ground around the little dock was soggy from the constant lapping of the small, gentle waves. Around the boat, there were strange footprints in the dirt. They weren't from a shoe. They were narrow and elongated. What looked like a set of 4 thin toes jutted out from a shallow heel. No animal came to mind, but then again, I'm not much of a naturist. I chalked it up to some kind of local fauna that I wasn't familiar with, and I returned to the cabin to wake up my wife to have some breakfast and a day out on the lake. We took the boat out for a while. It wasn't particularly cold, so we stayed out a bit longer than we planned. When we returned to the cabin, we grilled some food, and after dinner decided to have another cup of coffee and sit on the chair by the house. We both fell asleep. I'm not sure what it was that woke us up, but the first thing I noticed was that it had gotten much colder. I looked over at my wife. In the light, I could see the tip of her nose was red, and as I went to shake her awake, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. down towards the water. I felt a pang of panic. Somebody had come out onto the island, like this was going to cause us some trouble maybe. But there wasn't any help that would get to us quickly. Our cell phones didn't even have service, and there was no landline. I shook my wife as I looked over her shoulder, trying to get a better look at whoever it was. And just as she was waking up, a gust of wind blew the branches overhead, causing an opening for the moonlight to shine down on the water's edge. What I saw shocked me. A pale, thin figure was crawling out of the water and onto the beach. It had 2 arms and legs that I could make out, and a head that was too large for its frail body. It didn't have any eyes as far as I could tell, and I could have sworn that I spotted a pair of gills along each side of its throat. My wife was waking up now, and I slapped my free hand over her mouth. Of course, this startled her, and I could see an angry flash in her eyes, but the look on my face quickly turned her irritation to concern. I nodded my head in the direction of the creature. She slowly turned to look, and I could feel her body go rigid when she saw it. The creature was roaming around now, slowly along the shore, seemingly aimless in its plodding. I whispered for my wife to follow me, and we quietly rose from the chair and began slowly stepping back towards the house. In an unfamiliar setting and with full attention on the creature, I accidentally bumped into the grill we had cooked on earlier. The metal spatula had been resting on top and it fell, clattering to the floor of the small paved patio that the grill was on. The clang sounded like a gunshot in the silent darkness, and the creature snapped its head in our direction. We both froze, waiting to see what would happen next. But almost immediately, the thing opened its mouth and let out a piercing scream, like a small child trying to scream while gargling. I grabbed my wife by the arm and I pulled her behind me, sprinting towards the house. I guess she had thrown a look over her shoulder as we ran because she was now screaming, "It's coming!" I didn't bother to look and instead dashed the last few feet, clinging to my wife. I threw open the door and tossed her inside, coming in just after and slamming the door shut behind me. The door was solid oak, and there were no windows on this wall, but there was a series of small raps at the door, followed by another squeal. We both stood frozen, too afraid to make any noise or move. After a few minutes of silence, we heard one last scream, further away, thank God, from the direction of the shoreline, and then that was it. We spent a sleepless night huddled on the couch in complete terror, praying for the sun to rise, and as soon as it did, we grabbed our belongings and ran to the boat deck. We had the boat loaded and we pulled out into the lake in less than 3 minutes. Spent the whole ride back to the main shoreline waiting for a sickly hand to come over the side of the boat, but nothing ever materialized. We got back to the office and dropped the keys with the clerk, not even explaining our early checkout. We didn't even ask for a refund. We have no idea what it was we saw that night, and frankly, I don't really want to know. I just want to share my experience with you and warn everybody else that there is something very inhuman living on or in Lake George.